eligibility requirements. Any child born in Australia from the 1st of July 2022 to a parent who holds a special category visa and is a permanent resident at the time of the child's birth will automatically acquire Australian citizenship at birth. Now, we know that many New Zealanders are here on a special category visa while raising families, working and building their lives in Australia. So I am very pleased to provide the benefits that citizenship provides. Welcoming our new Australian citizens will just strengthen the bonds between our great nations, and they more normalise the relations that Australians have enjoyed the opportunities who are in New Zealand for many, many years. And I do want to pay tribute to those who, through their voluntary organisations, have worked for this change. Many of them have joined us here today. This has been a substantial lobbying effort that has been made, just saying that New Zealanders who are here in Australia paying taxes, contributing to the economy, should be treated with the respect, and that's what this provision will do. Strengthening our bonds, strengthening the relationship between our two great nations. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Can I also acknowledge the passing of Barry Humphries and say that Dame Edna is an institution in New Zealand as well as Australia, and I'm sure New Zealanders will also be feeling that loss. As we observed when I visited in February, Australia and New Zealand are more than friends, we're family. People-to-people links are at the core of our relationship. Both of our governments have publicly acknowledged that the situation in Australia for many New Zealanders has been challenging. New Zealand has long sought a fair go for them and arrangements that are reciprocal to what is offered to Australians living in New Zealand. And so I'm pleased to be here today to mark a significant step that Australia has taken to make the pathway to citizenship much easier for New Zealanders who choose to live and work permanently here. As I noted in my remarks at the ceremony, I do want to particularly acknowledge you, Prime Minister Albanese, and your leadership of these changes. I also want to acknowledge the members of your government who have supported our Aus-Kiwi advocates here in Australia over a long period of time. These changes are historic. They're the biggest in a generation, and they will make an enormous difference to the lives of so many people making Australia home. Before the ceremony, the Prime Minister and I had a discussion on some of our other key common areas of interest. In particular, we discussed the geostrategic challenges in our region and how as allies, Australia and New Zealand can continue to work together to advance our common interests and values. We're close friends who work together to defend these essential values in an increasingly complex world. The discussion did include Australia's recent announcements on AUKUS, and New Zealand, like Australia, is clear-eyed that there is a challenging strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific region. We both want a stable, secure and resilient region, and New Zealand agrees with the AUKUS partners that the collective objective needs to be the delivery of peace and stability and the preservation of an international rules-based system in our region. We have a long and positive history of working together on these matters, and I also acknowledge our ongoing joint commitment to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and I welcome your assurance that nothing in the AUKUS arrangement alters Australia's commitment to that. We also discussed aspects of the bilateral relationship, especially this 40th year of the closer economic relations agreement. This year is an opportunity to acknowledge the transformational impact that CER has had on our economies, our integration, and our economic resilience. From a New Zealand perspective, we want to continue to drive further integration of our economies. We talked about the possibility of new initiatives this year, and of course we talked about arrangements for the annual leaders meeting later this year. And I look forward to meeting Prime Minister Albanese again in the coming months, both at upcoming international events such as the King's Coronation, but also when you have an opportunity to visit New Zealand, where we will make you very, very welcome. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Now we've got a schedule of questions. list, so we might go Australia, New Zealand and alternate. The first question was from Lauren.
For you, Arno, do you see New Zealand playing a role?
We're informal in Australia, Prime Minister.
Apologies. Do you see New Zealand playing a role assisting or the AUKUS partnership? What's the extent you've kept New Zealand Prime Minister informed about the decisions of AUKUS?
We certainly have a very strong relationship, and I have kept, prior to the announcement in San Diego, certainly the Prime Minister was kept informed, as you'd expect. And today we had another discussion about peace and security and stability in the region. The Pacific Island Forum will be a particularly important one coming up as well. And I welcome and I want to thank and pay tribute to the role that New Zealand plays there. When I came to office as Prime Minister, you had the potential, well, not just the potential, you had a diminution of participation at the Pacific Island Forum. And we know that when you have a body made up of more than a dozen countries, once you have a withdrawal, that can very easily lead to a second withdrawal, a third, a fourth. And it is important that the Pacific Island family stay together. And so New Zealand has played a very important role there. New Zealand will continue to play a very important role at the Pacific Island Forum that will be held in the Cook Islands later this year. New Zealand.
Prime Minister Jessica Mackay from Television New Zealand, a question for Prime Minister Albanese. How much will the citizenship scheme cost, and are you worried about border security? And are you worried about border security, New Zealand being used as a back door to Australia, for example?
Now, what this does is normalise relations to where, in my view, they should always have been. The New Zealand citizens who have today made a contribution to becoming Australian citizens are ones who've gone through quite an extensive application process, becoming permanent residents. That's cost them money, in excess of $4,000, but it's also cost the government money as well. When you establish multiple steps and processes, it not only creates bureaucracy and delays, what it does is it costs money. There's a fiscal cost to that. Now, New Zealanders who have been contributing through the tax system, who've been contributing to Australia, will, as a result of these changes, make citizenship easier, which will mean that they have entitlements sooner. But those entitlements would have come through. They were just very much a delayed process. So I see this as being a common sense approach, and also being consistent with the rules that are there in place already for Australians in New Zealand, who it's slightly different. It's 5 years, but we might talk about a slight tweaking there over a period of time. But the truth is, New Zealand has been ahead of Australia before today. And you know what true friends do, and mates, as we like to use that term, they have equal relations. And that's the partnership that Australia and New Zealand have. Next from Michelle.
Michelle Tucker, ABC News. Prime Minister, your government is releasing the Defence Strategic Review tomorrow. And as we've both stated, Australia and New Zealand have been close allies for many years. Do you think both countries are still close allies when it comes to responding strategically in our region, in particular China?
We are absolutely close allies, and will remain that in perpetuity. I can't imagine a circumstance where Australia and New Zealand aren't the closest of friends. And we were talking today in our bilateral meeting about the assistance that Australian Defence Force personnel and equipment have made, including aircraft, to the operations assisting the victims of flooding in New Zealand in just very much recent times. I might say as well, when Australia has had bushfires, floods, natural disasters, the people who are first there on the ground from international support are always the Kiwis. We work together closely in the Pacific Island Forum. We work together as countries of the realm as well, as Commonwealth nations, and we continue to have common interests of ensuring peace, security and stability in the Pacific region. So I see this as a permanent feature of our relationship, which will continue into the future. New Zealand.
Kia ora, Amelia from Newsub. Like New Zealand, Australia is suffering its own worker shortages, and there is concern back home that this might lead to a brain drain if we give New Zealand citizenship over here. So is this basically a play to pitch some of our brightest workers? And to Hipkins, what are you going to do about it?
Okay, well on the first, we welcome all of your smartest and brightest, but I've never met a Kiwi who wasn't smart and bright. And so the contribution that will be made is being made already. That's the truth. People are here now. And one of the things is that Australians like to claim Russell Crowe, the Finn brothers, and so many others as Australians. So we have attempted to claim as many people as possible over the years. It's a pity that we haven't been able to claim better rugby players from New Zealand, and we might be a bit more competitive than we've been over the last decade. But what this will do is, I don't think it will lead to more people from New Zealand coming to Australia. It will just mean that they're treated better when they're here. Simple as that, and that's the objective here.
Well, I'd echo many of the comments that the Prime Minister has just made. This is fundamentally a question of fairness. These New Zealanders are living in Australia, they've made their lives in Australia, and by not being able to access the pathway to citizenship, they also haven't been able to access many of the public services that they should be able to rely on. And so we see this as a question of fairness. In terms of whether it will lead to more New Zealanders moving to Australia, I don't believe it will. I believe it will lead to New Zealanders who are in Australia being treated more fairly, and we welcome that. But I'm absolutely confident that New Zealanders living and making a life in New Zealand will want to continue to stay with the home of the All Blacks, the true home of the Pavlova and the Lamington. There's plenty of reasons for them to stay back home in New Zealand.
I must say, if you look at the figures, there's been an increased number of Australians travelling to live in New Zealand in recent times as well. That's what the figures show. Stephanie Bennett.
Prime Minister, just a question for you. Any further changes that you think Australia should be to those citizenship rules? I guess secondly, Prime Minister Albanese alluded to it. We're very excited about what he's setting up here in Brisbane. Do you expect any New Zealanders to play very involved in these changes?
Well, look, with regard to the Olympics, can I say that Prime Minister Albanese and I, I'm sure, will both be there at the opening ceremony in about 10 years' time to welcome everybody in our respective roles as we're well into our ongoing tenure. We welcome events like this happening in New Zealand and in Australia. They're great for both economies, great for tourism on both sides of the Tasman. We're quite excited about that. The first part of your question was about. Look, we absolutely welcome the announcements that have just been made. I think from the New Zealand side, it resets the clock. It puts us back into the position where we wanted to be all along, and so we're very happy with the decisions made by the government.
Can I just welcome Prime Minister Hipkins' optimism there about us being both Prime Ministers in 2032. Last question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
To both. Now that the corrosiveness has been sort of removed from the trans-Tasman relationship, what are sort of regional issues that both countries can move forward in particularly how important is it that New Zealand joins that pillar 2 of
there are a huge range of issues that New Zealand and Australia will continue to work together on, and Treasurer Chalmers and I discussed some of those last night. We have very intertwined economies where there are enormous opportunities for New Zealanders in Australia and enormous opportunities for Australians in New Zealand, and we can continue to work together on those issues. In the areas of commerce, for example, there are some new and emerging opportunities and challenges which we can work together on, including making sure we have common regulatory systems that make it easy to do business on both sides of the Tasman. And areas around climate change and energy efficiency, for example, are areas where New Zealand and Australia share common commitments, and so we can work very closely together on those. We'll continue to work together closely with our Pacific neighbours to make sure that we've got a strong and stable, Pacific region. And New Zealand and Australia have always worked closely together on those issues, and I'm sure we'll continue to do that.
Thanks very much, Prime Minister. Can I say that the difference between Australia and New Zealand and almost any other relationship, we have important neighbours to our north with Indonesia, PNG. We have important relationships in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean as well. The thing about Australia and New Zealand and our relationship is that something that is positive in New Zealand is good for Australia, and something that's positive in Australia is good for New Zealand. So dealing with the challenge of climate change is an example where we're working really closely together, both of our governments in alignment. When I talk about Australia becoming a renewable energy superpower, that should be not divorced from the work that will take place in Kiwi research institutions, along with our important institutions of universities, the CSIRO, etc. There is a common interest that we have going forward. And when an event occurs, like the Brisbane Olympics, guess what? People who come to Australia during that period will also drop into New Zealand before and afterwards as well. There'll be common interests going forward there. So I see this relationship as being absolutely critical, as being one that is literally a win-win in all aspects, which is why the announcement that we've made this weekend, that we've worked closely with the Prime Minister on during our first meeting just a couple of months ago. I set the target of, it's always good to have an aim and a target, and the target was to get all this done prior to Anzac Day, because on Tuesday is about commemorating and honouring our forebears who fought for our democratic values and fought for our freedom. And it's a way in which as well we pay tribute to those men and women who serve in our respective defence forces today. So I think it is a very productive relationship. I look forward to seeing the Prime Minister at the King's coronation, again, part of the historic links that we have, in just a short period of time, and then seeing each other at NATO as well in Lithuania in July. But also I look forward to visiting New Zealand as well as to the work that we'll all do through our leadership forum. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
talking about the Jets. I mean, what is your best pitch to Australians to move to New Zealand?
New Zealand is a fantastic country to live, work and to raise a family. We offer a really high quality of life in New Zealand. We welcome movement of people in both directions. And so, as the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Albanese just pointed out, there are already increasing numbers of Australians migrating to New Zealand.
What makes it so great? Did it grate you when Anthony Albanese said he's happy to take the brightest and best from New Zealand?
Oh, well, I know where you're going with that, and I know what you want me to say, but I won't. But look, we welcome the best and brightest from Australia to New Zealand as well.
What makes you so confident that there won't be a brain drain?
The people that we're talking about here are living in Australia already, and they've been living here for 4 years. I don't think that this is going to make a material difference to whether New Zealanders choose to come to Australia. They're going to be making those decisions based on a whole lot of other criteria, and I don't think that this is going to be one of them.
The economic perspective, I mean, do you see the merit of New Zealand joining the like defence exchange that we just talked about? Or will we sort of left behind in defence technology if we're not part of it?
What I've always said is that the three partners in AUKUS, Australia, the UK, the US, they are important partners for New Zealand as well, and we collaborate with them on a range of issues. Our existing 5-country arrangements that include those countries and Canada are incredibly important to New Zealand. We'll continue to look to further those relationships where the opportunities arise to do so. In terms of the AUKUS arrangements in particular and what Pillar 2 might mean for New Zealand, we're open to having those conversations. We haven't had those yet. Until we know more about that, I don't think it would be right for me to be ruling things in or out.
One of the things that was heralded was having another bilateral formal meeting in New Zealand. Firstly, do you have any sense of when that will be and where? But secondly, we're about to celebrate, we are now 40 years of CER. I mean, it's a pretty bedded down agreement. What are the next big things we can do economically in the relationship to actually move forward?
So in terms of the bilateral relationship and the bilateral meetings, we both share a commitment to doing that later in the year. There have been a few scheduling issues that mean that the first set of dates that were selected aren't necessarily feasible, but we both agreed that we'll get our teams to work together to make sure we can lock in some dates so that can happen.
Before the election?
We'll work together to lock in some dates to make sure that can happen. You're distracting me. In terms of the second part of, or the first part of the question, I think about where we go with the relationship. I think, as I alluded to in my comments earlier and in the dinner last night, I think there are an emerging range of issues where we share so much in common and we share so many common interests that we can work together to make sure our systems are aligning. If I think about renewable energy and I think about climate change, for example, and I think about the economic incentives around that, New Zealand and Australia working together to make sure we're making it easy for people who are working in that space to be working on both sides of the Tasman, to be sharing knowledge, expertise, talent. That's going to be good for both countries.
Is hydrogen part of that?
Hydrogen can absolutely be part of that. But just making sure that the initiatives that we're putting in place to tackle the challenge of climate change on both sides of the Tasman, there's an economic framework that sits behind that. And so working together as much as we can, they'll never be identical. Our economic frameworks are, but making sure that we're aligning where possible is a good thing.
I noticed you almost singing along on Advanced Australian Fair. I mean, it's a really good anthem. Have you ever thought of getting rid of our one?
It's not something that's on the books at the moment, Fran.
Can you see the churlishness that some Kiwis might have it? You being in an Australian citizenship ceremony, standing behind the Australian crest, welcoming Kiwis leaving Australia?
Ultimately, these Kiwis have left Australia some time ago. So they've been left New Zealand some time ago. They've been in Australia for some time already. They've often made their homes here. Now, if I look at it on an issue of fairness, the main thing that accessing Australian citizenship will do for those Kiwis is it will allow them to access public services that they have otherwise been denied access to. I actually think that that's better for New Zealand because in the absence of being able to access Australian public services, the fallback position was New Zealand public services, which they ultimately weren't contributing towards because their taxes were being paid here in Australia. So I think it is a good deal for New Zealanders as well because by allowing those Kiwis living in Australia to access public services here, then the burden's not falling back on the New Zealand taxpayer.
What about deportations? That's been a big issue as well. There's been a drop in a number of deportations from Australia to New Zealand. Do you want to see more action on that?
New Zealand's always respected the rights of Australia to deport people who have broken the law in Australia. It's a right that we have as a sovereign country as well, and it is a right that we exercise from time to time. The long-standing position of the New Zealand government, though, has been that we objected to Australia deporting people who had to New Zealand, who had no real relationship with New Zealand. So they may have come to Australia as children, for example. Their whole families were here, their lives were here, and they were being deported to a country with which they had no prior real relationship, other than a piece of paper to show that that's where they were born. I think the common sense approach that's being taken by the Australian government now to factor that into decision making about deportation does address a lot of the concern that New Zealand governments have, successive New Zealand governments have been raising.
You must be pleased.
The closer-economic relationships, obviously, we spend a lot of time with good relationships with other countries. We're looking to hopefully go to China this year as well. Outside of, take those two, Australia and China on the table, where else in the region or beyond is a global speaking at the moment? If it wasn't an election year and solutions to be focused, where would you be wanting to go and spending time in Britain from a trade and economic perspective?
The ASEAN region as a whole continues to contain huge possibilities for New Zealand in terms of our trading relationship. As Minister of Education, I travelled to a variety of different countries to promote New Zealand as a destination for education. So places like Indonesia, like South Korea, there's possibilities for New Zealand in that area. Obviously, New Zealand still would like to pursue trading arrangements with some of the countries that at the moment it's proven to be difficult. We'd like to continue to improve our trading relationship with the United States, for example. I know that questions around India have been raised in recent times. There's certainly something that New Zealand continues to be open to exploring. One of the barriers there has been dairy. We've taken a long-standing approach across successive New Zealand governments that we won't enter into trade agreements without dairy being on the table. So, others might be willing to take dairy off the table. That's not a decision that we've taken at this point.
Because on India particularly, is there an argument to be made that actually the relationship with China at the moment is quite good and trade is good, and that actually the time should be in places like India where there is a model to
As I've said, the trading relationship that New Zealand has with our existing big trading partners is one that we have to continue to cultivate. It's one that continues to be important. But market diversification is also a really important objective for the New Zealand government. And so being able to promote trade agreements and to lead missions that help to further that goal of trade diversification, that's got to be good for all New Zealanders and for the overall health of the New Zealand economy.
Do you want to take dairy off the table when it comes to negotiations with the deal?
It's not something that we have considered at this point.
Is it something that should be considered though? I mean, given the way things are trending, we all talk about value-add products and setting commodities, why not take it to the table?
As I've indicated, it's not something that we have turned our minds to or given too much to at this point.
Considering all the announcements were made before you even left Wellington, what did you actually gain out of it?
Well, the overall strength of the Trans-Tasman relationship, as you can see from the visit, is a very, very strong one. I think it's important that we acknowledge the decision that the Australian government has taken. I've been leading a significant business delegation who are over here making good connections. As the dinner last night, for example, was an incredibly positive one, a great opportunity for business-to-business contacts, to open some doors for Kiwi businesses who are working in Australia in a way that I think will be very positive for them. There is an opportunity for the Māori economy to connect more with the Indigenous economy here in Australia. I actually think it's something that we're just starting to see some early signs of some really exciting progress there, and these sorts of trips help to further that. So I think it's for a relatively brief visit, I think we've managed to accomplish a lot.
Do you have a word to describe the trip?
Really encouraging.
Just to put a full stop on the deportations question, did you need to raise it with Albanese this time around?
No, I wasn't.
Could you give us some more fulsome list of the topics discussed?
I went through them. Obviously, we had a fairly wide-ranging conversation about the economic environment in New Zealand and Australia, many big challenges that we're facing. We're both heading into a budget season, so we had a little bit of conversation about that. I won't share any of that, but clearly the overall economic picture of both countries was a topic of conversation. We had a brief conversation around Lucas. We had a conversation around the most recent announcement that was made and the ins and outs of some of that. I think the ongoing commitment we have to strengthening the economic partnership between the two countries. the celebration of the 40th year of CER. And the potential for us to take that to the next level. That's not going to be something that we're making up on the spot, but actually it's something that we can continue to explore. And I hope over the next year, during that 40th anniversary time, we can do that.
Prime Minister Albanese.
Last question.
Yeah, did Prime Minister Albanese speak with you at all about what would be on the table when he hosts the Quad in Sydney next month?
No, we didn't.
Did he explain how they landed on 4 years? Was it a case of trying to one-up New Zealand or a recognition of the harm the policy it caused?
And what's it like to have a fellow saucy-loving world leader?
Look, on a personal level, I can say we get on very, very well. We share many interests in common, and then being able to enjoy a bit of a snag off the barbie is definitely something that we both enjoy.